Good afternoon and welcome an important and stimulating conversation brought to you live by the Israel Committee of Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, which I'm co-chairing with Arthur Stein. This two-part program just before the elections and in the aftermath of the elections was made possible by the generous support of the Schwartz Israel Fund. Please note that the Q&A platform allows participants to post their questions throughout the program and will play a role in this discussion. To walk us through the fourth Israeli elections in 2 years, we have with us two exceptional thought leaders and active leaders, two people I consider friends and mentors. Ambassador Aharoni and Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch may not need introduction, but I cannot resist the temptation. As we have a global audience and who may not know Moshe. Ambassador Aharoni is a veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service whose last post, some of you may know, was as Consul General of Israel in New York and a few states around it. He served for 6 years as a distinguished diplomat here and brought with him something new, the new branding of Israel, which he led and gave Israel visibility beyond the conflict. Since his retirement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he has been involved with many initiatives, intellectual and business in nature, all innovative. Rabbi Ammiel Hirsch is my spiritual leader. A Fabrente Zionist, for those who know Yiddish, it is full of fire, full of passion and enthusiasm for the state of Israel, who does not hesitate to offer his criticism always in the context of love and appreciation for the miracle that Israel is. Rabbi Hirsch is a lawyer by profession and a rabbi by inspiration, as he is coming from a line of important rabbis in the Reform movement. Abi's parents made Aliyah. He went to high school in Jerusalem and served in the IDF as tank commander. In his youth, he was considered prodigy pianist, which might explain why our synagogue has the best pianos, one of the best pianos in New York, and has the most musical and beautiful service. Ami Hirsch will lead us through this important conversation, and I look forward to hearing both Ami and Ido as they lead us through this important and critical period in Israel's life and the life of the Jewish community. Please, Ami.
Thank you, Shula, very, very much. And I want to thank Arthur Stein and the Israel Committee for putting all of this together. It's always a very popular program for us whenever Ambassador Aharoni comes to the synagogue. Ambassador Ido, our friend and our supporter, welcome. It's good to have you back. You might remember the last time that we had you at the synagogue. It was during Yom Kippur, if I'm not mistaken, and the entire downstairs social hall was packed because always we want to listen and to hear what you have to say. So welcome to us. We'll engage in a conversation for those of you who are online. Thank you also for being with us. And we expect to end by 1 p.m. So Ido, just to start us off, welcome to the United States. I know you come from time to time to do some work here and to teach. So we're very happy to have you back here in the United States. Let me just start with a general question for you about Israeli society and the mood. We observe here that Israel is leading the world in COVID-19 vaccinations by far, proportional to the population. And I was wondering whether you can give us some kind of overview on why that's the case, what impact that has on the population. Is Israel beginning to open up? And most critically, that we're now 48 hours or so from the elections themselves, whether all of this, in your view, will have an impact on the outcome of the elections.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Hirsch, for your question. Thank you for your role. I have to say that you are really a part of a long link you're a link in a long chain of Reform rabbis that were Zionists, and you always supported the state of Israel. And even when you had some reservations about its policies, I also wanted to thank my dear friend Shula for her kind introduction. You're asking a very relevant question. Let's start with the part about why Israel has become a leader in the vaccination. And the answer is both historical and practical. Historical, Israel is one of the few countries in the world that back in 1920 established its own, what was then trade union, but the reason why the trade union was established, the Histadrut, was to guarantee the rights and the needs of the workers in what was then Palestine. And so with the establishment of the trade union, we also established the first HMO in Israel called Klalit. After Klalit was established, Maccabi Health was established, and two other HMOs were established. And until this very day, every Israeli universally has health insurance with one of the four HMOs. What does it mean in practical terms? It means that the official Israel can communicate directly with every Israeli, either by email, by through their cell phone number, using the text messaging, or through the application. So the country, because of its size, 9.2 million people, because of the fact that it is networked through the HMOs, became a perfect beta site for either Pfizer or Moderna. And because both companies have already established wonderful relationships with the Israeli HMOs, it was only natural that Israel would become the beta site. So unknowingly, we the Israelis participated in a major experiment. And luckily, the experiment seems to be successful. So that's the first question that you asked me. The second question, is it related to the outcome of the elections? Absolutely. Israelis feel that the country is going back to normal, that things are moving in the right direction in a very robust way, and unquestionably that it will be reflected in the way people vote.
And do you feel that the campaign was timed to reach this point in some way, or it just worked out this way? And do you find that the government's general treatment of the pandemic, was it competent, and did it take into account the upcoming elections?
So these are two separate issues. Governments, for the most part, all over the world, not only in Israel, were not prepared for the pandemic. And as a result, the coronavirus became the perfect storm because it exposed the systemic and the inherently built-in structural deficiencies and weaknesses of governments all over the world, by the way. And even governments that are not transparent to us, let's say the Chinese government, rest assured that there were deficiencies and weaknesses there as well, because no one was prepared to deal with this pandemic. Having said that, again, in Israel, and there's a great deal of criticism against the government in Israel, not only from its political opponents of Likud, but also from within the Israeli civil service itself. And the allegations were made public, and they all revolved around the politicization of the virus. And this is one of the issues at the heart of this campaign.
Do you? I just saw a report. I think it came out yesterday. There's an annual group that does an annual report on happiness. What countries are the happiest in the world? And they came out with a report, I think it was just yesterday, where they suggested that they found that Israel is the 12th happiest country in the world, behind mostly Scandinavian countries, but ahead of important countries like Germany, Canada, the United States, the UK. Are people really happy in Israel? Because, with all the tensions in Israel, we don't normally associate Israelis with the 12th happiest country in the world. And does that, in your opinion, affect the elections in the upcoming week?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. By the way, we used to be number 5 in 2010. This is the happiness index is run by Gallup International, and apparently we used to be happier. But the question of happiness is extremely relevant because it's about your subjective condition. How do you feel about your life? Are you happy with where you are? Obviously, there's a confirmation bias here. Most people, even if they're unhappy, claim that they're happy because this is what they want to project. So those studies suffer from some credibility issues, but nevertheless, they do reflect a general sentiment, which I believe to be accurate, that Israelis are by and large happy with what they are, with where they are financially, socially, and so on and so forth. Why? Because the Israeli economy is doing well. GDP per capita in Israel is fast approaching the European level, which is around $45,000 a year per capita per annum. In the United States, for example, it's around 60. So there's still a $15,000 more so gap between the GDP per capita in Israel, which is one of the ways to measure people's happiness is if they feel safe economically. And so most Israelis pre-COVID-19 traveled abroad 2 or 3 times a year, even though they were not making tons of money, they felt comfortable financially to travel. So it has a lot to do with the way people oppose change. People that say, I'm comfortable, why should I change if I'm comfortable, tend to vote for to preserve the existing status quo. People that are not happy, people that have more of a critical view of what's happening in Israel, tend to vote for a change, and hence the deadlock in the Israeli electoral system.
Yeah, I see that. That's really interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way before. So people who express contentment, they are more wedded to the status quo. They're likely to vote for the people who they associate the people in government as being responsible or partially responsible for their happiness, for their contentment. So why change?
Yeah, exactly. And because if you look at it, the system produces more or less the same results for 2 years, more than 2 years, more or less the same results. There are basically 2 blocks, almost identical in size. One block is happy with the situation, for whatever reason, we can talk about why. And the other block is more critical of the reality. This is the story.
Well, let's actually, that's a good segue. Let's actually talk about the specific issues in the upcoming elections. What, in your view, are the key issues? The impression that we get just by reading the media in Israel is it's essentially all about the prime minister, to Bibi or not to Bibi. So is that accurate in your view? And what are the other key issues that are driving the electorate?
Yeah, I think it's a distorted view of what's happening. There are a few things to understand about what's happening now. In the old days, the main issue was where you stand on geopolitical issues. More specifically, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the defining issue that really was the dividing line between the various camps. And you had a very formidable political camp in Israel called the Territorial Compromise Camp that was represented by people like Yitzhak Rabin. The last prime minister that camp produced was Ehud Barak, also the person who is chiefly responsible for the destruction of that camp. That camp was based on the idea that the most pressing matter, the most, I would say, the most visible hurdle that Israel is facing is lack of resolution to the conflict, and therefore this should be the main thing. And basically they offered a very simple bargain. You give the Palestinians what they want, namely land. You get from them what you want, namely peace and security. And Ehud Barak even used the terminology, the finality of all claims. And with that, he went to Camp David in the summer of 2000 and fell flat on his face. The other camp opposed the territorial compromise, and there's a solid majority in Israel that supports territorial compromise. Even today, by the way, the two-state solution is something that most Israelis would accept, including Netanyahu. But what happened was that in an astonishing series of mistakes, the Palestinians themselves had written themselves off the conversation. How? By rejecting the two-state solution presented by Clinton, by rejecting the Ehud Olmert plan of 2008 that would have given them 100% of the territory, by reacting the way they reacted to Ariel Sharon's unilateral pullout, by supporting Iran in the conflict between Israel and Iran, and now by objecting the Abraham Accord. You know, they were burning the flags of the UAE, the same UAE that is transferring $400 million a year to pay salaries for the employees of the Palestinian Authority. So it's hard even to comprehend the series of mistakes made by the Palestinians. The result is that the Palestinian conflict is off the table. It changes completely the landscape for the Israeli voter.
You know, that's a really important point to emphasize, because in terms of what drives some of the political discussion here and what motivates the American Jewish community and is a factor in how people view Israel from outside of Israel, from the West in particular. There's still a vestige of the Palestinian issue. We still call it the peace process. I don't know if you want to comment. Is there actually a process, and is its goal still peace? But
the sense of urgency is gone. The sense of urgency is gone.
So the Israeli electorate it's not a high factor for them when they go into the voting booths this week. It's not a high factor, an important consideration for them.
Yeah.
What are the parties' perspectives on the peace process?
Yeah, and we know that because the two parties that were the champions of the territorial compromise camp, Labor and Meretz, are fighting for their lives. It's not that people don't support the two-state solution. It's that it's not of priority right now.
So what is?
The Israelis don't feel it's their fault. They say, you know what, to the Palestinians, you had 3-4 chances of cutting a deal. You didn't want to. The hell with it. That's why Israelis were so in favor of Donald Trump's foreign policy, because it reflected the sentiment that every Israeli could relate to. What Donald Trump said basically was to the Palestinians, don't expect me to be an honest broker. You made a mistake. I'm not going to reward you for your mistakes. Actually, you're going to pay for your mistakes. And the Israelis loved it. They thought it was brilliant. Finally, they said, someone is telling the Palestinians what they should hear, and not like the Europeans were constantly trying to appease them, only pushing them further into their dire straits. And that's what the Israelis liked about Donald Trump's Middle East policy, which I know most Americans opposed, but that's a different story. So what is it that the Israelis care about? I would say that because of the information revolution, Israelis are now very much like the Americans, are being bombarded by so many stimulations simultaneously. Our brain is incapable of dealing with all this saturation of information. So the Israelis, like the Americans, like the Brits, are looking for simple solutions to highly complex problems. Don't bother them with details too much. They're looking for simple solutions. I think that the campaigners that have the ability to speak in that language of sound bites, of simple solutions to highly complex problems. Namely, we have in this particular election campaign 3 candidates that have that ability. One is Netanyahu, the other is Yair Lapid, and the third is Bennett. The main issue today is the social tension between the ultra-Orthodox community and the rest of the country.
So, and are you suggesting that most of the people that will vote for, say, the Likud, I don't want to say the entire right-wing spectrum, but most of the people voting for Likud don't mind the ultra-Orthodox involvement in policymaking?
Yeah, Likud is an interesting entity because, and I like the fact that you mentioned Likud and you didn't say Netanyahu, because this is something a lot of people don't understand about the Israeli system. The prime minister is not the commander-in-chief, is not even the diplomat-in-chief. It's the Israeli cabinet. In Israel, the system is very different. So you don't vote for Netanyahu, you vote for Likud under Netanyahu. And you made the right distinction. Likud is a different, unique case because Likud generates the kind of loyalty that we had not seen in Israel since the days of labor under Ben-Gurion, the legendary Mapai. It generates the kind of loyalty that football clubs generate, or basketball clubs generate, or college teams generate. So meaning I'm going with Likud no matter what. No matter who's going to be the head of Likud, by the way. Likud is a brand, very powerful brand, perhaps the strongest brand in Israel's history. However, Likud under Netanyahu, contrary to the common belief, is severely underperforming. Likud under the same Likud, under Ariel Sharon today, guaranteed 50 seats, not 30 seats. It seems like Netanyahu's Likud under Netanyahu has a glass ceiling of maybe 30 seats. Traditionally, Likud was able to attract close to 50 seats under Begin, and of course, under Sharon. Even Yitzhak Shamir, who was certainly not your charismatic leader, he got 48 seats as the leader of Likud. So Likud, on a good day, is getting 25% of the votes. It's very, very important to understand. And there are many people that vote Likud that do not support Netanyahu. It's also something that should be mentioned. Now, what makes this campaign very, very unique is that for the first time, Netanyahu is being challenged from his right. So Gideon Sa'ar, who's now projected to get anywhere between 7 to 10 seats, is part of Likud. He left Likud. Some other Likud members left with him, and he's challenging Netanyahu from the right. And that's a new thing. And I think that it will change the outcome of the, maybe this time the deadlock will be ended because of that.
Let me ask you something. You mentioned the Haredi parties, and you find that the tension between that population and a significant part of the rest of the electorate is an important factor in this upcoming elections. Of course, as you know, you were fantastic, great consul general here, and we always appreciated your involvement and your support. The issue for American Jews, overwhelmingly being not Orthodox, was always a central issue, and it affected the Israel-diaspora relationship. One of the frustrations we always had was that it didn't seem to bother the Israeli society in general, and that it was not a driving force in the election campaigns, that there were other issues that were much more important to Israelis. And yes, they would have preferred less influence of the ultra-Orthodox parties, but other issues took precedence. And now you're suggesting that this is playing a more significant role. One, what do you base that on? And two, is it connected to the past year of the COVID pandemic, where we have seen some of the behavior in the ultra-Orthodox community that particularly troubled and frustrated the non-Orthodox community.
Yeah, and I think your second question answers the first. So I base my observation on the response of the Israeli society to the way the Haredi community handled the the COVID-19 crisis. And for a very simple reason, COVID-19 is testing our morality as individuals. So it's maybe the best example to the interdependence. So there is no economy without health. That's the first lesson that we learned because of COVID-19. There is no society without health, right? And our health is dependent upon each other. So we have to be mutually responsible for our collective health. And here you have a community that generated a lot of animosity and rage from Israelis from all walks of life, even traditionalists. One of the things that American Jews find it very difficult to understand about Israeli society is that on a scale of religiosity, if you're a Reformed Jew in America, you're far more religious than a secular Israeli. But there is this creature in Israel known as the Israeli Traditionalist, like my father was like that. It's an Israeli who is non-practicing, non-observant, Orthodox. So the only form of Judaism they know is Orthodoxy, and they develop this very positive predisposition to the Orthodox traditions. And both my parents are like that. They don't go to synagogue. They don't, my father passed almost 4 years ago, but he was a perfect example. He even had major issues with the chief rabbinate. My father would argue against the rabbis, the Orthodox rabbis. He was a product of harsh Sephardic education, and therefore he was very critical of the rabbinical establishment in Israel. Yet the only form of Judaism that he knew was Orthodox, and although he never practiced it, and he was a traditionalist. There are many, many Israelis like that. And they're the ones who had a positive predisposition towards the ultra-Orthodox. And the main argument that you would hear from Israelis like that is that they're the ones carrying the torch. They're the ones making sure that the DNA of our people will go from one generation to another. Well, that ended. That ended with COVID-19 very abruptly. Israelis are angry. Israelis are upset. And Israelis are going to, and you will see that in the results. Yair Lapid is projected to have over 20 seats, and I believe that to be the case because he represents the anti-ultra-Orthodox agenda. Same thing goes for Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beitenu, who's projected to get anywhere between 7 to 10 seats. Again, that's his main banner.
I just might suggest to you that the behavior, the perceived excesses of that ultra-Orthodox community during the period of COVID occurred here as well, with some of the same types of frustration, reactions of frustration. One always needs to be careful, of course, because other people and other communities had excesses in terms of their behavior with respect to COVID discipline also. But the difference, of course, is that here, the ultra-Orthodox community does not have political power in government. They have influence like every other community in the political system. But uniquely in Israel, political power was granted to this, I must say, mostly unrepresented element of the Jewish community. They are actually a fringe element of how most Jews identify with Judaism. So let me just ask you before we leave this topic, do you have anything to say about the recent Supreme Court decision that recognized non-Orthodox conversions in Israel? Here, it was a significant issue. In Israel, it didn't seem to raise kind of any additional awareness. What do you think? I would just, maybe you can frame your answer in the context of Israel-diaspora relations, because this is one factor in a long line of issues that have, as you know from your service here, has frustrated and impeded the relationship between the American Jewish community and Israel.
Yeah, so, it's a very, we could have a whole session just about that topic, but the Supreme Court was reluctant for many, many years to deal with this issue because they say, and I believe that they are right, that this is really not their job. It's the job of the Israeli legislator. And the Israeli legislator, the fact that the Supreme Court had to intervene reflects the weakness of the Israeli legislator. Israel's legislative body, the Knesset, has declined in stature significantly in the last 20 years or so. And you remember the days of the beginning of the conversion bill controversy in the mid-1990s during Netanyahu's first government, which was, again, an immediate, once Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996 and the ultra-Orthodox became his political allies, the first thing they did, they tried to capitalize on that partnership. And that's how the conversion bill controversy came into being, if you remember, in 1996. And it hasn't really stopped since then. And the Israeli legislator is afraid to deal with this hot potato, again, exactly because of the tremendous political leverage that the ultra-Orthodox parties carry. And so the Israeli Supreme Court had to intervene because the Israeli legislator is reluctant to really tackle this issue head on. Now, the question of the political clout of the ultra-Orthodox is not going to change. If anything, they're expected to have more and more political clout. What is the solution? The solution is, there are two solutions. One is practical. It's already happening in huge numbers, by the way, to bypass the chief rabbinate. That's what many, many young couples do, including my own kids, by the way. And they're bypassing the chief rabbinate, not because they don't have any faith in Judaism. It's just that they don't have any faith in the rabbinical bureaucracy, which became a nightmare for many, many young couples that want to receive religious services. So that's one way. The second, of course, is to look at Israel not through the prism of necessarily the chief rabbinate, but to have troops on the ground. What does it mean? The ultra-Orthodox will continue to exercise their political leverage because they can. And it's perfectly legitimate, by the way. It's perfectly legitimate. They have the voters, they have the political representation, and now they have the political clout as a result. What we don't have is another voice that speaks on behalf of the more progressive streams within Judaism that will be represented in the Knesset. And the reason why we don't have that is because we don't see those youth movements, we don't see those summer camps, we don't see the same system that exists in America. We don't see that in Israel. Yes, we have more and more reform and conservative synagogues in Israel, and I think that's important. But it doesn't translate into political leverage. And in order for that to change, I think some action needs to be taken.
Let's get to the events of this week. So I want to ask you a two-part question, and we can follow up on any one of them if you don't want to answer them together. One, are you at all concerned that this is the fourth election in 2 years? Does it reflect in any way on the stability of Israeli democracy? And two, when we wake up on Wednesday morning, what is the situation going to be? Can you predict that? Can you surmise that? Or should we just be patient and wait and see the results in midweek?
Yeah, so the fact that we are in this vertigo is very, very alarming, because it really, the main damage is that people lose faith in the political system. People lose faith and in Israel's democracy. When people lose faith, they lose interest. They are less willing to engage, and they become emotionally detached. And when people become emotionally detached, then this is the worst place that you can be as a nation. When people really don't care. And you see that because Israeli politics is not attracting the same people it used to attract in the past. And again, one of the reasons the Knesset as a brand is declining so rapidly is because of the fact that you don't find the elite, the best of the best, going into politics. In fact, if anything, the best of the best are shying away from Israeli politics, as if it was a disease. So that's the the bad news. The good news is that you still have many Israelis that are involved, many Israelis that do care, many Israelis that have a critical view of reality, and they want to change from right and left. And today, the definition of what is right and what is left in Israel has dramatically changed. It's no longer about geopolitics. It's no longer about the issue of the Palestinians or even the Iranian issue. It's about life itself. It's about, am I comfortable? If I'm not, it's about the economy. It's about different approaches to the management of the country and so on. What will happen? It's hard to predict. On the one hand, I think that there's no reason for Netanyahu, who was unable to form his own Likud-led coalition in the last 3 election campaigns. The third one, he was bailed out by blue and white faction headed by Benny Gantz that formed a coalition with him, but he violated all the agreements that he had signed with them. And so now, on the one hand, I don't see how he would do better now than he did last time. But there is also a great deal of disappointment from Blue and White's decision to go into the coalition with Netanyahu. Many people on the left of center bloc feel that Benny Gantz violated their trust. He doesn't feel that way, by the way, obviously, because he's running again. And so we may wake up on Wednesday morning to the very same deadlock, with Netanyahu able to form maybe a 59 or 60 seat coalition. Even, by the way, even if he gets 61, it's not expected to live long, this coalition. We have to understand this is a very, very fragile structure. And so we may have to go to a 5th round. We may even have to go beyond that. But if you ask me personally, I don't see how Israelis feel better today than they felt 6 months ago. If anything, Israelis are more critical of the situation. So I believe we will wake up to the very same deadlock, 60-60, maybe 59-61. We'll see. It will be, it's hard to predict because there are several parties that are fighting for their own survival. At least 3 or maybe even 4 political parties that are on the verge of making it because of the threshold, which is very high. You need to win at least 4 seats to get in. That's not an easy task. So Meretz, you have Benny Gantz's Blue and White, and some even parties that are projected to have 5 or 6 seats may find themselves like Yamina 2 years ago didn't make it, although they were projected to win between 7 to 10 seats. In the end, they didn't make it. So it's very difficult to predict.
Ido, you mentioned that there's a sense that the best of the best don't go into politics in Israel anymore. Many of us here have the same impression that the best of the best don't go into American politics anymore. And that leads me to my question about the aftermath of the election. There's been, of course, we've been very concerned with, I don't even know what to call it, Trumpism, populism, whatever you want to call it, this phenomenon of challenging truth that there is, in fact, no objective truth. That truth is whatever you want to make of it, and the seeming manipulation of the electorate, the populace, to bend them towards your subjective political interests rather than agreeing on certain objective truths. And there has been some fear expressed, and I don't know how realistic it is, and maybe you can comment on this, that were the prime minister to find himself in the minority or not pleased with the results of the elections, that he too would challenge the electoral process as President Trump did in this country. Do you find credence in that?
Well, it's very difficult to make those comparisons between Trump and Netanyahu because the system is so different. Trump could have inflicted the damage that he had because of the presidential powers. In Israel, the prime minister does not have presidential powers. In fact, the prime minister in Israel is more powerless than powerful. And although I know the media makes it look like the prime minister in Israel is, can do anything, and they treat him as if he was a king. They call him king. And the truth is that the prime minister, any prime minister, including Netanyahu, is very limited in what they can do because of the Israeli structure. The system in Israel is very, very different. The post-truth political conversation, which today is associated mostly with populist regimes. And I like the fact that you use the term populism. A lot of people look at what's happening, they say, oh, it's the rise of nationalism. No, it's the rise of populism. It's very different than nationalism, and I can explain why. But it's important to understand it was born out of very progressive philosophical thinking of moral relativism. The idea that there are no more objective facts. Like you can't say this is a high form of culture and this is a low form of culture. It's not correct to say that anymore. You can't use those terms anymore. And I even remember some American thinkers after 9/11 blaming the United States for 9/11. That's where it's coming from. When a philosopher like and a gender studies expert like Judith Butler claiming that Hezbollah should be understood, that Hezbollah's goals are legitimate in her, from a philosophical point of view, then you understand where post-truth is coming from. So yes, we will see more of that, definitely, because again, of the information overload. And the only solution to that is informational distancing, meaning to limit our exposure to information and to limit our exposure only to those sources that are credible providers of news. The fact that we are now exposed to WhatsApp groups, which is the #1 platform for the dissemination of fake news. We're being exposed to information that was never verified by anyone. And this is the real danger. So the solution is to limit ourselves in the exposure to unverified news sources. And I can tell you that I tried to practice this myself during COVID-19. It was a real threat. It was actually one of the main problems of dealing with the pandemic is the saturation of information that was mostly irrelevant about the pandemic. And again, the solution is informational distancing.
So just going back to my question, and maybe it's not that important, and we'll just see what happens after the elections. But there has been some concern that has been expressed that the prime minister will replicate what Trump was trying to do here. You're not worried about that?
No. Israelis are not. For the most part, they really don't care. There's an ongoing demonstration in front of the prime minister's residence and last night it was reported 20,000 people. During the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War, there were 400,000 people demonstrating against the government. So if anything, yeah, there are people, I said before, there are people that are very unhappy with the way the government handles things in Israel. But you don't see any counter demonstrations. A handful of people on the other side are challenging them. When I say a handful of people, I mean 10, 15 people, that's it. So I find it hard to believe. It's not the same. It's not going to happen in Israel if I had to predict. This is not a scenario that you can. It happened once before in Israel's history. It was Menachem Begin in the early 1950s who urged Israelis to march against march on the Israeli legislature, on the Knesset, because of the reparation agreement with the German government. And most of the people that marched were survivors. He managed to get a big portion of the Israeli society. He turned it into a big controversy. Of course, today we know that without the reparations, Israel could not have overcome the economic hurdles of the early 1950s, absorbing millions of refugees and so on. So, but the only prime minister in Israel's history that, the only politician in Israel's history that acted in a way that was similar to what Trump did on January 6th was Menachem Begin.
Ido, are you concerned about the impact of the far right in the next government, that there are parties, or a party that is Kahanist, that the prime minister is cultivating in a certain way, anticipating that they either may be part of the next government or he may need them in some way. And there was some kind of agreement to distribute votes. That it's a complicated system, but yeah, you know, we're negotiations.
No, I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about it at all, because I know Israeli society, and I'm familiar with deep research that was done. Israelis are certainly not racist, and Netanyahu himself will do anything he has to do in order to survive, and that is also, again, within the rules of the Israeli system. That is also legitimate. It's very important for people to understand that what he's doing is allowed by law. It's not that it's not part of the political game. What worries me about Israel is something connected, but not entirely related to what you describe as Kahanism, and that is the fact that Israeli society is rapidly sinking into the depths of what I call ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is today, in my view, the biggest threat to the state of Israel. The detachment from what is important globally, the decline in the relevance of Israel to the global agenda. And what is ethnocentrism? Is the inability of a certain society to experience life, to experience the world through any other prism but its own. So, for example, climate change, which is the #1 issue today globally, is a non-issue going into the election campaign. People are going to vote in a couple of days, and climate change is not on the agenda. Israelis are completely unaware of the issues that bother most of the world. Now, that's a danger. When a country that wants to be a player, that wants to be a respected member of the family of nations, is completely detached from the global agenda, it's a very worrisome sign.
Ido, we have an economic question here from one of our listeners. I'll just read it to you. If the center-left manages to build the governing coalition, do you expect that they will maintain a commitment to the reform liberal economic policies that have been in place since the mid-1990s and has propelled the growth of the Israeli economy?
Yes, I believe that this will happen regardless and again, the main complaint against Netanyahu on the economic side is the fact that Israelis feel that he had given the ultra-Orthodox more than their fair share. And that's the main complaint. That's why the issue of the tension, and again, I don't want you to understand from what I'm saying that Israelis blame all the ultra-Orthodox. No, they mostly blame their leadership, the leadership that is trying to disconnect them from the rest of the country. I have many friends in the ultra-Orthodox community. In fact, one of my business partners is a Haredi, and I have a great deal of sympathy to the challenges that they're facing within their own community. But there's no question as to the fact that their own leadership is failing them. So I think that whoever is going to form the next coalition, if at all there is going to be a next coalition, if we're not going to go straight to a fifth campaign, then those policies are not going to be changed.
We have another question here with respect to the Arab Israelis. What is their influence likely to be this week? And in particular, we've read that the Prime Minister has made a special effort to reach out to Arab Israeli voters.
So there. In fact, I see this as in fact, Netanyahu, from his right-wing conservative support, in their view, he made a terrible mistake. Why? Because one of the most effective tools Netanyahu had against the left of center bloc is that it's not legitimate to form a Zionist government that is relying on the votes of the Arabs in Israel, because the Arabs do not support the very goals of Zionism. And the state of Israel was established upon those principles, right? So this was a very effective weapon. In fact, Benny Gantz was reluctant to build a coalition, although he could theoretically have a coalition that relies on the Arab votes, because he was afraid Netanyahu will attack him, that what he's doing is not legitimate, it's anti-Zionist. So Netanyahu voluntarily basically gave up on the most effective tool he had historically against the left of center bloc. Even in 1996, his main argument against Shimon Peres was Peres will divide Jerusalem, meaning he will go with the Arabs. So now this is no longer the case. So Netanyahu, I'm sure this was, I'm a great believer in the theory of unintended consequence. I'm sure this was not his intention, but he did something that was never done by any other prime minister in Israel's history, and he kosherized the Arab vote, which I think is going to change the Israeli political system for good. And I will not be surprised that if we will see in years to come, not only Israeli coalitions that are based on the Arab vote, but even the Arab parties, just like the Haredi parties, are going to be part of the government, and they're going to fight for their own fair share of the budget. And this is the main motivation of that particular faction within the Arab political spectrum that is talking to Netanyahu about possibly supporting Netanyahu, because they're saying, you know what, it's time for us to think in practical terms, forget the Palestinians. Again, it's one of the byproducts of the fact that the Palestinians are absent, self-inflicted absence, by the way. And now the Arabs are saying, we want a piece of the budget as well. So the way to do it is to be part of a coalition. Whoever is going to be in power, we will demand budgets. We will demand to be part of the process and so on. If you want us to recommend your party to the president, then you have to pay a price for it. And I think that this is what they're trying to do. And again, it's legitimate, and long term, it's actually a good thing for Israeli society.
Yes, I think we all agree that the more communities feel they have not only electoral representation, but a stake in the outcome, the better it is. And this is particularly important for the Israeli Arab population that feels, and to a certain degree justifiably, has been disenfranchised from the mainstream of Israeli politics. But not only that, of course, with respect to budgets as well. And they feel that parts of their community have been neglected. Ida, we are just about running out of time. We still have lots of issues that we're going to discuss the next time, mainly relationships with the United States, the Iranian issue, the new administration, the new Biden administration, how that'll impact on the future. I do want to mention one thing and then give you an opportunity for any closing comment. The one thing I want to mention is, if you have any influence there, it would be nice to have a consul general here in New York. So if there's anybody you can talk to, we've been spoiled by people like you and your predecessors and your successor. So that would be nice.
You know, the one of the byproducts of the information revolution is that the traditional tasks of diplomacy were taken away from diplomats. So diplomats are no longer needed for representing their government's policies because the leaders do it themselves on Twitter or Facebook. They no longer are needed to negotiate because the leaders negotiate directly. They no longer needed to advocate policy because the leaders do it themselves. So diplomacy has to reinvent itself. The immediate result is that political leaders all over the world, you saw it under Trump, we see it in other countries, we see it in Israel, looking at the civil service as not only as a problem, but even as their enemy. So they don't trust the civil service. They never trusted the civil service, by the way. I felt it myself. And so now I know, I thought to myself, I just published an interview in Israel where I speak about the importance of American urban centers. And the fact that there is no consul general in New York is just so, I was laughing because it's so symbolic to the sad state of things we are in today when it comes to the relationships between politicians and their civil service. And it's so sad that I can't even begin to, unfortunately, I have no influence over this issue. And I wish that the Israeli Foreign Service will reclaim its place in its important place in the Israeli system and will restore its glory because it used to be once a glorious diplomatic service.
Well, let me just use this as an opportunity, one, to tell you again that you made an indelible impression during your diplomacy here, your period of service. It made a huge difference, not only to the grassroots American Jewish community, New York Jewish community, but also with respect to the leadership and the relationships you have established. As I said, through people like you, we've been spoiled, and we feel the absence, your personal absence, as well as the foreign service in Israel. So I want to thank you for everything that you have done, everything you are doing, all that you will do for our people and for the Jewish state. And to all of our listeners, we'll be back with Ambassador Aharoni in about 3 or 4 weeks. Look for those promotions, and we'll see you then. And before we go, if I can turn it to the co-chair of the Israel Committee, Arthur Stein, to say a few words of summary.
Yes, hello, this is Arthur Stein, co-chair of the Israel Committee. I want to add my thanks to Ambassador Aharoni for sharing his keen insights with us today on the upcoming elections and on the political landscape in Israel. And I look forward to welcoming the ambassador back again for the second part of this 2-part webinar series. It's exactly 4 weeks from today on Sunday, April 18th at 12 noon Eastern. Of course, we're also grateful to Rabbi Hirsch for leading the dialogue and for his engaging questions on the issues and challenges that are facing Israelis as they head to the polls. And we shall see how the elections unfold in the days and weeks ahead. And we look forward to seeing you again on April 18th when we reconvene to discuss the results of the elections and explore their ramifications, and also see if the ambassador's predictions prove correct. Thank you for joining us, and to all of those involved in the organization of this event and the generous support of the Schwartz Israel Fund.